In 1750, China produced more than one-third of all goods in the world. England was just a peripheral nation, cold, wet, unremarkable. But 50 years later, everything had changed. England led the world. China was left behind. The question is, how did a country with almost no resources become an industrial superpower? The first look is very strange. China had everything England didn't have. China had a massive population, resources, advanced technology, a developed economy. England had what? Coal mines, some skilled craftsmen, a good navy. But that's not the whole story. Underneath the surface, a completely different system was at work. A system England had ready-made, but China didn't. A system you can't see with your eyes, but you can feel everywhere. And it was about to change the entire world. To understand what happened, we have to go back to 1600. England back then wasn't a nation. It was a collection of conflicting interests, power factions, feuding families fighting for control. But then people like Cromwell showed up and said, "No, we're going to do this differently." England went through a civil war. A war not just about political power. It was a war about ideas. It was about what makes a good society. And when the dust finally settled, England had changed. The old powers were no longer absolute. New ideas were allowed to exist. There, in that space, a new class of people started speaking up. Not nobles born with silver, not priests wielding religious power, but business people, merchants, working people, people with ideas. And in England, those ideas weren't suppressed. They were protected. They were encouraged. They were rewarded. China was different. China had long been a superpower. Decisions came from above, from the emperor. Systems had existed for thousands of years. Why change if things were working? Why bother if you were already winning? But that safety became a trap. By the 17th century, England discovered a problem. Their coal mines were getting deeper and deeper. To dig deeper, they needed to pump water out. Manual pumping was the only way. But workers could only pump by hand for a few hours before their arms gave out. They had to sleep. They had to eat. They had to rest. This was everyday misery. Second after second after second ticking by with nothing accomplished. The mine was flooding. Money was being lost. And there was nothing you could do about it except say, "Keep going." But then, in 1712, a craftsman named Thomas Newcomen had an idea. If we can't ask humans to pump continuously, then we'll build a machine to do it for them. That machine would use steam to create motion. It would pump day and night, never getting tired. Steam hadn't been used before. The ancient Greeks knew about steam, but they used it to open a door in a temple, a novelty, something to amaze people. They didn't see the potential. Newcomen saw it differently. He saw a problem. He saw a solution. And most importantly, he lived somewhere where you were allowed to build things, where you were allowed to try, where you were allowed to fail. In England, nobody told him, "No, that's not how we do things." Nobody said, "That's dangerous." Nobody said, "You'll lose all your money." He was allowed to build his machine, and it worked. Miners could now dig deeper. They could open mines that were previously unreachable. England would start leading the world in coal output. But the story doesn't end there. A few decades later, a man named James Watt looked at Newcomen's machine and said, "Okay, but it's wasting a lot of energy. Water has to be heated, then cooled, then heated again. That's terrible. If we could keep the water hot continuously, the machine would be much more efficient." And he built that machine. In 1769, Watt's improved steam engine was unveiled. It was a turning point. It used 4 times less fuel to produce the same power. It was a revolution. But there was another problem. To run this machine, you needed to find the first ball to roll. You needed an initial job. You needed an industry. In England, textile manufacturing was the biggest industry. For hundreds of years, women sat at wooden looms, weaving cloth by hand. It was slow. It was exhausting. It hurt. Even if you wove continuously all day, you could only produce a certain amount. You couldn't go faster. Your hands could only move so fast. That was the human limit. In 1764, a man named James Hargreaves had an idea. If one person can't weave fast enough, then we'll build a machine to weave instead of one person. If we need 8 threads at once, his machine would provide 8, then 16, then many more. That machine was called the spinning jenny, and it changed everything. Now a textile worker could produce as much cloth in a day as it would have taken 10 workers to produce before. It was a major shift in economic activity. It meant cloth was now much cheaper. It meant everyone could buy cloth. Prices dropped. Demand went up. Because demand went up, you needed to build more machines. But to build those machines, you needed metal. You needed precision-cut parts. You needed people who knew how to work with metal. England had coal mines again. Coal could be used to heat furnaces to melt metal. If you had enough coal, you could produce steel. If you had steel, you could build machinery. If you had machinery, you could produce everything else. That's the system. Each part depends on the other. Each part creates something the next part needs. And all those parts were available in England. China didn't have that system. China had population. China had talent. But China didn't have the freedom to try, no freedom to fail, no freedom to build something new. To build a machine in China, you needed permission. You needed a license. You had to make sure it aligned with what the emperor had decided long ago. And if the emperor didn't like your idea, or if it threatened the powers that were, then you couldn't do it. In England, you just did it. If it worked, you made money. If it didn't work, you lost your money. That was clear. That was definite. There was no ambiguity. And because of that, inventors in England started paying attention. They started bringing their ideas forward. They started building machines. They started making a difference. Another man, named Richard Arkwright, looked at the spinning jenny and said, "Okay, but if we combine it with something else, if we add gears and spindles, we can make it much faster. We can produce much higher quality cloth." He built that machine. Then he did something even smarter. He didn't build one machine. He built a factory. A massive building filled with machines. Dozens of machines, hundreds, all connected to each other by gears and belts, all powered by the force of a single steam engine. It was an entirely new arrangement. Nobody had ever seen anything like it before. Before this, textile workers worked from home. Their parents had woven. Their grandparents had woven. The whole family had woven. That was all they knew. But now, you had to go to a factory. You had to stand next to a machine for hours. You had to do repetitive work. You had to tolerate the noise. You had to tolerate the heat. You had to make sure you didn't get caught by the machine. Because if you did, it wouldn't stop for you. It would pull you in. It would hurt you. That was a different life. It wasn't like what their parents had done. It was much worse. It was more painful. It was more dangerous. And if you didn't work, if you got sick, if you were too slow, you'd be fired. Someone else would be hired to replace you. There were plenty of people who needed work. Plenty of people willing to endure those conditions just to earn money for food. So they came. Thousands of them. Tens of thousands. Hundreds of thousands. Farmers abandoned their fields. They went to the big cities. They went to the factories. They stood next to machines from sunrise to sunset. And gradually, something new began happening. The entire structure of society started changing. Workers were no longer farmers. They were machine operators. They were factory workers. That was a completely new identity. And when you have thousands of workers, you need housing for them. You need things to sell to them. You need to cook for them. You need a doctor if they get sick. You need a priest if they want to pray. So new cities started forming. Manchester, Liverpool, Birmingham. Cities that didn't exist a century before. Now they had hundreds of thousands of people. That was an explosion. That was uncontrolled growth. But everything has a price. These machines need to run all day. Workers need to be brought in. Materials need to be transported in. Products need to be taken out. And all those processes need something to connect them together. Roads, rivers, and, if you can imagine it, something called a railway. In the early 19th century, a man named George Stephenson said, "We have steam engines. Why don't we put them on wheels, run them on iron rails, and use them to pull carts full of things?" It sounded crazy. Carts were pulled by horses. Horses were fast. Horses were reliable. Why would you use a machine? But Stephenson built it anyway, and it worked. A steam engine could pull tons of cargo over long distances in ways a horse could never do in a lifetime. Now you could transport things. You could transport them fast. You could transport them cheaply. You could connect cities. You could connect factories. You could sell things in places far away from where you made them. It was a complete system. Coal mines to get energy, machines to produce, factories to concentrate production, workers to run the machines, cities to house the workers, and railways to connect it all together. England didn't plan this system. It just happened. It happened because each person had a problem, and they wanted to solve it. Newcomen wanted to pump water out of mines. Hargreaves wanted to weave cloth faster. Arkwright wanted to build a factory. Stephenson wanted to transport things. None of them were trying to build a revolution. They were just trying to do their job better. But by doing their job better, they built something beyond anyone's knowledge and experience. They built a system you couldn't see all at once. You could only see the pieces. But those pieces worked together in wonderful ways. China, at this point, was still a major superpower. They had technology. They had talent. But they didn't have something that England had. If you were an inventor in China and you came up with an idea the emperor didn't like, you were done. Your idea would die. You might die. But even if you didn't die, you would never build it. You would never try. You would never know. In England, if the emperor or some official didn't like your idea, you didn't need him. You could find someone else to finance it. You could find a merchant. You could find an investor. You could sell your idea. You could make it real. That was the difference. That was the underlying system. China was still strong until now. But England had something China didn't have. England had freedom. England had the freedom to fail. England had the freedom to try. England had the freedom to innovate. And because England had those freedoms, England started innovating. Quickly. Very quickly. Too quickly for any other nation to keep up. By 1850, England was producing nearly half of all goods manufactured in the world. Nearly half. A small nation. A nation with no special resources. A cold nation. A wet nation. But a nation that had something nobody else had. China now produced only a fraction. England, I know now what you are. England, I know your power. England, I know you will never hurry. England, you've lost the competition. You've lost your place. And once you lose it, it's very hard to get it back. Now, if this sounds like we're talking about ancient history and it's irrelevant, think again. Because the exact same system still exists today. The exact same dynamic is still in the hands of modern nations. Nations that have the freedom to innovate. Nations that have the freedom to fail. Nations that have the freedom to pursue crazy ideas. Those nations lead. And nations that don't have that freedom, nations with concentrated power, nations that don't allow innovation, those nations get left behind. That's the real lesson of the Industrial Revolution. It's not about machines, it's about people. It's about allowing them. It's about a system where you're allowed to try. So that's the question. Which nations right now have those freedoms? And which nations might lose them? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Comment below. Which side do you think is leading today? And if you like these kinds of stories about how systems change the world, check out my next video. Why did the Soviet Union collapse? That's also about a system. But this time, it's about a system falling apart. Thanks for watching.